For the ruthless billionaire owner, punctuality was his religion. When a flustered new waitress showed up 10 minutes late, he pointed a single finger. "You're fired." But as she turned to leave, his eyes caught the glint of a vintage gold watch on her wrist. His ruthless mask instantly dissolved into raw, agonizing shock. The billionaire shot to his feet, his chair crashing to the floor. What secret did this cheap piece of jewelry hold to shatter the composure of one of the world's most powerful men? Before we start, your support means everything to us. Like, comment, and subscribe so we can keep sharing stories like this. Let's start today's story. The sound of the heavy oak chair crashing onto the marble floor echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous, hushed dining room of the Gilded Cage. Every sound, from the discreet clinking of silver on porcelain to the low murmur of billion-dollar deals, instantly ceased. The air itself, usually thick with the scent of expensive perfume and rich cuisine, seemed to hold its breath. Hundreds of eyes, belonging to the city's elite, turned as one. They were frozen, forks suspended halfway to their mouths, conversations cut mid-syllable. They were witnessing the impossible. The owner, the city's most ruthless and disciplined titan of industry, a man who had famously never shed a public tear, was standing amidst the wreckage of his table. His face, usually a mask of cold, practiced authority, was gone. It was replaced by a visage of such raw, agonizing shock that it was almost unrecognizable. His perfectly tailored suit suddenly seemed too large for his frame, which was visibly trembling. His manicured hands, which signed checks that could make or break economies, were shaking uncontrollably. His authority, the very atmosphere of power that surrounded him, had not just cracked, it had crumbled into dust. The young waitress, the target of his earlier, icy dismissal, stood paralyzed. Her humiliation at being fired in front of this opulent crowd was instantly eclipsed by a new, sharp terror. She was trapped in the spotlight, a specimen under the glare of the entire restaurant. She wanted to run, to disappear, to simply melt into the plush carpet, but her feet were lead. The manager who had been gently escorting her out was now a statue, his face pale, caught between his boss's cold command to fire her and this new, terrifying emotional explosion. The billionaire took one step, then another, lurching forward like a man walking in a dream. His vision tunneled, the crystal chandeliers and the horrified faces of his patrons blurring into a meaningless watercolor. He saw only one thing, the glint of gold and sapphire on the girl's trembling wrist. His breath came in shallow, painful gasps. He reached her, his hand outstretched, not in anger, but in a gesture of desperate, pleading vulnerability. A sound escaped his throat, a dry, choked rasp that was utterly alien in this temple of refinement. "The watch," he whispered, his voice cracking with an emotion so profound it stunned everyone into deeper silence. "Please, where did you get that watch?" The manager, Mr. Harrison, his face a pale mask of professional terror, practically shoved the young waitress through a heavy, soundproofed door hidden behind the wine cellar. The opulent silence of the private study was a sudden, deafening contrast to the public spectacle she had just endured. The door clicked shut, sealing her inside with the billionaire. The room was his inner sanctum, a place of suffocating luxury, all dark mahogany, rich leather, and the faint, sterile scent of old money. He was no longer the shocked, vulnerable man from the dining room. His public breakdown had morphed into a private, frantic desperation. He paced the plush carpet like a caged animal, his hands raking through his perfectly styled silver hair. He looked at her not as a person, but as the keeper of something he needed, his eyes fixed solely on her wrist. He did not ask her to sit. He lunged for his desk, his movements fast and erratic. He fumbled for a heavy, leather-bound checkbook, his fingers, which were usually so steady, now clumsy. He tore a single page out, the sound ripping through the quiet. He grabbed a heavy gold pen, scrawled an unreadable signature, and thrust the blank check at her. "Name your price." His voice was a low, desperate rasp. "Tell me what you want." The paper trembled in his hand. The waitress flinched, her back pressing against the hard wood of the door. The check was a symbol of a world she could not comprehend, a solution to problems she lived with every single day. Her mind, in a flash of agonizing clarity, went to the pile of red-stamped medical bills on her kitchen counter, the looming eviction notice, the constant, gnawing fear that kept her awake at night. This single piece of paper could erase all of it. 100,000, he said, seeing the hesitation in her eyes, mistaking her shock for negotiation. "Is that it?" "No, 500,000. I will write it in right now. $500,000. He was pleading, his desperation making him almost pitiable. The sum hung in the air, glittering and seductive. She could feel the dizzying pull of it, the promise of a life without fear, but then, instinctively, her other hand covered the watch. She felt the cool, familiar metal against her skin, a comfort she had known her entire life. She saw her mother's face, smiling and tired, her hand fastening the delicate clasp on her wrist. It was the only thing she had left. Her only link to a past she barely understood. Her fear, so palpable just a moment ago, receded, replaced by a sudden, surprising well of strength. She lifted her chin, her voice barely a whisper but clear and unbroken in the silent room. "I am sorry, sir," she said, pushing the check back toward him. "I cannot." The billionaire stared, his mind unable to process the refusal. He looked from the check to her worn-out shoes, to her cheap polyester uniform. It did not make sense. This was the answer to everything. But she simply clutched her wrist tighter, a silent, definitive gesture. "It was my mother's. It is all I have left of her." The heavy mahogany door swung open without a knock, a sudden, sharp intrusion that sliced through the thick atmosphere of desperate, unanswered questions. Alexander, the billionaire's son and the company's formidable chief operating officer, stood on the threshold. He was the physical antithesis of his father's current state, where the father was a wreck of raw, unbridled emotion, his tie loosened and his face pale with shock. Alexander was a pillar of cold, surgical precision. His suit was a flawless armor of dark charcoal, his tie a perfect, steely gray knot, and his eyes, the same stormy color as his father's, held not a trace of confusion, only a sharp, reptilian assessment of a situation that had clearly gotten out of control. He had already received 3 urgent texts from board members who had witnessed the scene in the dining room. His fury was not hot. It was a cold, controlled burn, reserved for incompetence and, above all, emotional displays, which he considered the most pathetic form of liability. His gaze swept the room, taking in his father's disheveled appearance, the shockingly unprofessional blank check still on the desk, and finally, the waitress. He looked at her as if she were a piece of gum stuck to his shoe, a contamination in his sterile world. His lip curled in a barely perceptible sneer of utter contempt. "Father, what is this?" he said, his voice not loud, but possessing a cutting Arctic edge that made the air in the opulent study even colder. "You are causing a massive disruption. The entire restaurant is paralyzed." He strode into the room, his expensive, hand-stitched leather shoes making no sound on the thick Persian rug. He did not look at his father again. He fixed his gaze squarely on the waitress. who visibly flinched, her small flicker of defiance from moments ago completely extinguished by this new, more terrifying presence. "You are being played." The words were not an opinion, they were a verdict. "This," he gestured dismissively at the girl, not even acknowledging her as a person, "is a classic grifter. She is a parasite. She sees a moment of weakness, a sentimental old man, and she pounces." The waitress, who had just found the strength to refuse a fortune, shrank back under the new, venomous assault. "It is not," she whispered, her voice trembling again, the words catching in her throat. "It was my mother's." Alexander let out a short, humorless laugh that sounded like ice cracking. Of course it was. He finally glanced at the watch on her wrist, but only for a second, his eyes filled with bored disdain. "It is a cheap knockoff, a pathetic attempt." He was not assessing the watch. He was passing judgment on her entire life, on her very existence in his world. He turned his head slightly toward Mr. Harrison, the manager who had been frozen by the door, a silent, terrified witness to the entire exchange. "Get her out of here." His voice snapped with the unmistakable ring of absolute authority. "You are still fired." He then turned to his father, his expression hardening into something resembling concern, but it was the cold concern of a risk manager, not a son. "We have a $500 million merger to think about. We need to do damage control, not play pathetic games with the help." The heavy door clicked shut, the sound final, sealing the two men inside the opulent tomb of the office. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating, a stark contrast to the raw, emotional torrent that had just transpired. Alexander, his form rigid and his face a mask of controlled fury, was the first to speak. His voice was a cold, sharp shard of ice. "Father, that was an unacceptable spectacle. You have just rattled our most important investors and humiliated yourself over a common grifter. We need to call security and have them handle the press." The billionaire, who had been slumped against his desk, his chest heaving, slowly straightened up. When he turned, his face was not the mask of grief the waitress had seen. It was a terrifying, deep purple hue of pure, incandescent rage. He advanced on his son, his steps slow and heavy, his eyes blazing with a lifetime of suppressed pain. "Pathetic." He hissed, the word a low growl. "You stood there, you saw that watch, and you called it a cheap knockoff." Alexander stood his ground, unfazed. It was a logical assumption. "A piece of junk. She is a nobody." The billionaire's hand lashed out, not to strike, but to grip his son's perfectly tailored shoulder, his fingers digging in like talons. "A knockoff." He spat the word back. "You do not even remember, do you? You were only 10, or maybe you just never cared. That watch, Alexander, that was my mother's. It was a one-of-a-kind piece, commissioned in Switzerland for their 25th anniversary. She wore it every single day. It was not just a watch, it was her. It was her pulse. It was the sound of her life ticking away in this very house." His voice broke, the rage momentarily giving way to a profound, gut-wrenching sorrow. "And your sister." His voice dropped to a whisper, the name of his estranged daughter an old, unhealed wound. "That night, the night your grandmother died, while I was in the next room, finally broken, signing the papers for the nurse, that ungrateful, selfish girl went into her mother's room. She prized it from her cold wrist. She stole it." He was sobbing now, great, racking sobs that shook his entire body. "She stole it, and she vanished. She took the last piece of her mother, the last piece of our family, and she ran. She destroyed us, all for what? A few $1,000 at some filthy pawn shop? He released his son, stumbling back, the fury spent, leaving only the hollow, aching void of his grief. For 20 years I have lived with that, the knowledge that my own daughter spat on her mother's memory. And today, that girl, that poor, terrified girl, she had it. It was the one. After 20 years, it was not a knockoff. It was the proof of the greatest betrayal of my life. And you, my son, my heir, you saw it, and you saw nothing but a complication. You saw a servant to be dismissed. The narrative the billionaire clung to, the one that had poisoned his heart for 2 decades, was a lie. The truth, buried under years of bitterness, was a far more tragic and deliberate betrayal. The scene was not a theft, it was a sacrament. 20 years ago, in the sterile, silent room of an exclusive hospice, the family matriarch lay dying. Her body was frail, a bird-like skeleton against the pristine, starched white pillows, the scent of antiseptic and funereal lilies heavy in the air. Her son, the billionaire, was in an adjacent office, his shoulders slumped, his own grief a fog, as he signed the final, devastating paperwork with the hospice director. He was vulnerable, shattered, and, most importantly, absent. In the room, his daughter Amelia, a gentle, artistic soul who had always shrunk from the family's brutal world of acquisitions, sat holding her grandmother's thin, papery hand. Her face was a landscape of pure, quiet grief, her tears falling unchecked onto the heavy blanket. The old woman's breathing was shallow, a faint rattle, but her eyes were sharp and lucid, filled with a deep, knowing love. Her fingers, weak and twisted with age, fumbled with the clasp of the delicate gold watch on her other wrist. It was the one with the single, deep blue sapphire. She weakly pulled it free and pressed the cool metal into Amelia's warm, tear-dampened palm. Her voice was a dry, rustling whisper. "For you, my light. Amelia, my dearest. You were the only one who ever saw me, not the name, not the money. You saw the person. You have my heart. Keep this. Remember the time we had." Amelia sobbed, a heartbroken sound, trying to press the watch back into the frail hand. "No, Mama, I cannot. It is yours. Always." But the matriarch's fingers closed over her granddaughter's, a final, surprising surge of strength. "It is yours now. A blessing." Before the tender, sacred moment could even settle, the door flew open, striking the wall with a violent crack. A young Alexander, barely 20 years old but already possessing the cold, calculating heart of a shark, stood on the threshold. He took in the scene in a single, freezing glance. He saw his grieving sister, the valuable watch in her hand, and his dying grandmother. He did not see love. He saw an asset being misappropriated. He saw his opportunity. "How dare you?" His voice was a venomous hiss, slicing through the holy quiet. "She is not even gone, and you are stealing her jewellery. You are a thief." Amelia recoiled as if struck, her grief instantly poisoned by shock and horror. "Stealing? I would never. She gave it to me." Alexander let out a short, ugly laugh. "A convenient story. You are pathetic. You were always a drain on this family, and now you are a vulture." He knew his father was just down the hall, broken and defenseless. This was his moment to cut his sister out forever, to consolidate his own position as the worthy, logical heir. Amelia, utterly devastated by the cruel accusation piled atop her sorrow, could not even form a defense. She just shook her head. the tears of grief turning to tears of rage. "I hate you," she whispered, clutching the watch, the last gift of love she would ever receive, and fled the room. She pushed past her father in the hallway, a blur of tears, too choked with a complex, shattering grief to explain. Alexander, his face composed into a mask of righteous, tragic anger, stepped into the hall. He placed a firm, steadying hand on his father's slumped shoulder. "Father, it is Amelia. I caught her. I tried to stop her. She took grandmother's watch. She stole it, right off her wrist." The billionaire, his world already ending, looked up, his eyes widening with a new, incomprehensible pain. The lie landed, a perfect arrow, taking root in the fertile, broken soil of his grief. The betrayal, the one he would recite for the next 20 years, was complete. The opulent office was a tomb of suffocating silence, the air thick with the ghosts of the last hour. The billionaire sat heavily behind his massive mahogany desk, the rage and grief having receded, leaving behind a hollow, agonizing void. He was a man shattered, his entire emotional foundation built on a 2-decade-old betrayal, now riddled with fissures of doubt. He kept replaying the scene in his mind. The watch, it was the one. His grief screamed that it was stolen. But then there was the girl, the waitress. He replayed her face, not the terror she showed him, but the quiet, unshakable dignity she had shown his son. The way she had clutched her wrist, her voice trembling but firm. "It was my mother's. It is all I have left of her." She had refused $500,000. He had built his empire on reading people, on separating liars from fools, and her refusal, her simple, desperate honesty, did not align with the narrative of a cunning grifter. The contradiction was a physical pain, a mental whiplash that left him exhausted and deeply conflicted. Alexander, on the other hand, stood by the tall window, his back to his father, looking out over the city skyline. He was the picture of unruffled, cold control. His father's emotional collapse was a messy, inconvenient variable, a temporary fire to be contained. He had already mentally catalogued the necessary steps, a public relations statement, a quiet word with the board, and, most importantly, the elimination of the source of the problem, the waitress. He was not conflicted. He was calculating. He knew the truth of what happened 20 years ago, and he would be damned if he let this nobody, this ghost from the past, unravel the perfect, profitable world he had built on that lie. He turned, his face a smooth mask of filial concern, a look he had perfected over years. "Father," he said, his voice a low, soothing balm, "you are distressed. Let me handle this. She is a nobody. We will pay her off, retrieve grandmother's watch, and this will all be forgotten by morning." The billionaire lifted his head, his eyes, red-rimmed and bloodshot, fixed on his son. There was no warmth in them, only a cold, weary suspicion. She refused the money. Alexander, he said it flatly, a fact. He had seen his son's contemptuous dismissal of the girl, and for the first time it had not felt like strength. It had felt like a blind spot, a chilling emptiness. He leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. "I do not want her paid off. I do not want this handled." His voice was quiet, but it was the voice that built empires, the one that did not tolerate refusal. "I want the truth." He pointed a finger at his son. "You find out everything there is to know about her mother, about how she came to possess that watch. I want facts. I want a timeline. I want to know who she is. Understood?" Alexander's expression did not flicker. He nodded, his face the perfect picture of a loyal, efficient son. "I will take care of it, father. I will have my security team run a full background check. We will find the truth." He projected utter confidence, the perfect, reassuring air. But as he turned to leave, his eyes were as cold and empty as a winter sky. He was not going to find the truth his father wanted. He was going to find the truth that would protect his own. The waitress fumbled with the cheap metal key, the old lock sticking in the warped wooden door. It finally gave way, the door groaning open on its ancient hinges. The contrast to the world she had just been violently ejected from was a physical blow. The gilded cage, with its soaring ceilings, its acres of polished marble, its air of effortless, soundless luxury, felt like a distant, cruel dream. This was her reality. Apartment 4B. The air here was not filled with the scent of truffles and expensive perfume. It was thick with the smell of old cooking, damp plaster, and the sharp, sterile tang of rubbing alcohol that always clung to the small, dim space. The linoleum in the tiny kitchenette was cracked and yellowed. The single window overlooking a grey airshaft rattled with a persistent, mournful sigh. Her humiliation from the restaurant, the icy contempt from the son, the terrifying, raw grief from the owner, it all faded, replaced by a much more immediate, familiar, and crushing weight: fear. In the far corner of the cramped room, separated by a thin, floral curtain, was a hospital-style bed. In it, her mother lay, a frail, bird-like figure lost in a nest of worn pillows. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes closed in a morphine-induced sleep. This was the waitress's entire world. This was her why she worked 2 jobs, why she never slept, and why the check for $500,000, the one she had refused, felt like a phantom limb, an ache of a life she could have had. She was jobless. The word echoed in the silence, a death knell. Fired, blacklisted probably. If the sun's venomous glare was any indication, she sank onto the threadbare sofa, the springs groaning in protest. Her gaze immediately fell upon the small, wobbly kitchen table. It was not a table. It was a monument to her failure. A mountain of envelopes, a landslide of paper, was piled high. They were not friendly letters. They were stark white and angry red. Final notice, disconnection warning, eviction proceedings. Each one was a paper cut on her soul. Each one a testament to the fact that she was drowning. She had held the solution in her hands. She had held a fortune, enough to pay for all of this, enough to pay for better doctors, for a cleaner room, for a life where her mother was not in constant, quiet pain. She had refused it. She walked on trembling legs to the small, peeling dresser. There, sitting on a faded doily, was the watch. It seemed to glow in the dim light, the small sapphire winking like a knowing eye. It was beautiful. It was her only link to her mother's past, the mother who lay sleeping, the mother who had given it to her with a weak smile, saying it would protect her. It was the only piece of integrity, the only piece of history she owned in a life defined by debt and desperation. She picked it up. The gold was cool and heavy. She was terrified. She was broken. She was unemployed. But as she fastened the familiar weight back onto her own wrist, she knew with a certainty that was both her greatest strength and her most terrible burden, that she could never have sold it. Alexander did not return to his father's office. The scent of grief and emotional chaos was repulsive to him, a contaminant. Instead, he descended to the sleek, glass-walled manager's office overlooking the bustling, frantic kitchen. It was his operational center, a place of cold, hard logistics. Mr. Harrison, the restaurant manager, was already there, summoned by a one-word text. He stood stiffly by his own desk, his face pale and clammy, a man who knew his own career was hanging by a single, fragile thread. Alexander did not acknowledge his greeting. He prowled the small, sterile space, his presence a vortex, sucking all the warmth and air from the room. He moved with a predatory grace, his dark charcoal suit a seamless armor. He stopped, his back to the manager, and looked down at the precise, beautiful ballet of the kitchen staff below. They were a perfect machine, predictable, controllable. Unlike the mess his father had created upstairs, he pulled his private, encrypted cell phone from his inner pocket, his movements economical and precise. He scrolled through his contacts and found Harrison's number. He pressed the call button. On the desk, not 3 feet from the terrified manager, the office phone buzzed, a harsh, angry, jarring sound in the quiet room. Mr. Harrison jumped, his eyes wide. He looked at Alexander's back, then at the phone, his confusion palpable. Alexander did not turn. His voice was soft, barely a whisper, yet it carried the unmistakable chill of absolute command. "Answer it, Harrison." The manager, his hand trembling, fumbled for the receiver, his throat dry. "Yes, Mr. Alexander." The girl. Alexander began, his voice a low, sibilant hiss, devoid of any emotion. "She is, of course, fired. That is permanent." Mr. Harrison began to stammer his agreement. "Yes, sir, of course. I have already processed the paperwork." Alexander cut him off. "That is not enough. A simple firing is a loose thread, a complication. This girl, this nobody, has made my father emotional. He is not thinking clearly. He is compromised. It is my duty to protect him and to protect this company from his sentimentality." He turned, his eyes flat, grey, and utterly devoid of life. A shark's eyes. "You are going to fix this. You will call every high-end restaurant in this city. You will speak to the Savoy. You will speak to the Regent. You will speak to the Continental. You will speak to every contact you have, manager to manager. You will inform them that the girl, what was her name? It does not matter. You will inform them that she was not just fired for incompetence. She was fired for suspicion of theft, a vague, unsubstantiated, but deeply damaging accusation. A missing bottle of Lafitte, perhaps. It does not matter. Her name is to be poison. I want her blacklisted. I want her to be unemployable." Mr. Harrison's blood ran cold. This was not just a firing. This was a professional execution. This was a starvation. He opened his mouth, a small, pathetic squeak of protest, but the word died on his lips as Alexander's icy stare held him fast. "I want her desperate. I want her broken. I want her to have no other option. When I am finished, she will crawl back to us, begging to take our money, and she will sign anything I put in front of her." The line clicked. Alexander had ended the call, though they were in the same room. The silence was absolute, broken only by Mr. Harrison's shallow, authoritative knock breathing echoed through the tiny apartment, a sound so out of place it made the waitress jump, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was not the shuffling, hesitant knock of a neighbor. It was the sound of power, of someone who was not asking for entry, but demanding it. She thought it was the landlord, the final notice of eviction personified. She pulled her thin cardigan tighter, her hands clammy with fear, and opened the door. Her blood ran cold. It was him, Alexander, the billionaire's son. He stood in the drab, peeling hallway, a stark, obsidian figure of immense wealth and power. He was a creature from another universe, and his very presence in this run-down corridor felt like a violation. His eyes, cold and grey, swept past her, taking in the small, cramped room, the cracked linoleum, the pile of red-stamped bills on the table. His upper lip curled in an expression of profound, undisguised disgust. The smell of the old building, the faint, lingering scent of her mother's illness, it was all an offense to him. He did not ask to come in. He simply took one step across the threshold, his expensive, hand-stitched shoe landing on her worn welcome mat as if it were something vile. He remained standing, a sterile, foreign object that did not belong, his very posture radiating contempt. He reached into the inner pocket of his perfect charcoal suit and withdrew 2 items: a folded, crisp bank check and a thick, legal-looking document. He did not look at her. He looked at the curtained-off corner where her mother lay sleeping, the sound of her faint, rattling breath just barely audible. $250,000, he said, his voice a low, flat monotone, the words dropping like ice cubes into the warm, desperate air of the room. He held the check out to her, a fortune, enough to save them, enough to give her mother dignity. The waitress's breath hitched, her eyes drawn to the numbers, a dizzying, impossible sum. Then his other hand lifted, holding the document. "Take it," he continued, his voice void of all human emotion. "Give me the watch and sign this non-disclosure agreement. It states you will never contact my father or any member of my family ever again. It states that this conversation never happened." She stared at him, speechless, her mind a whirlwind of confusion, temptation, and a new, rising horror. He saw her hesitation, and his cold, Arctic gaze finally met hers. A small, cruel smile touched his lips. It was not a smile. It was the baring of teeth. "Or," he said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a sibilant, monstrous whisper, "you can refuse, and I will use my power, the power you cannot even begin to comprehend, to make sure that," he nodded toward the curtain, "your mother is moved from this apartment and into a state-run facility by the end of the week. I will have her declared unfit for your care. I will have you declared unfit. You will lose everything." The threat was so precise, so personal, so diabolically cruel, it sucked all the air from her lungs. He was not just offering money, he was presenting her with an execution. Her mother's dignity or her mother's memory, a logical choice, he said, his eyes empty. The check for $250,000, a sum so vast it was almost meaningless, trembled in Alexander's outstretched hand. The waitress's eyes were locked on it, her mind a frantic, agonizing battlefield. She heard his words, the vile, precise threat echoing in the tiny, silent room. A state-run facility. The words conjured images of cold corridors, in different hands, the final, humiliating stripping away of her mother's dignity. All her life, she had fought to prevent that. She had sacrificed her sleep, her youth, her entire existence to keep her mother safe, to keep her here, surrounded by the few familiar things they owned. Now, the solution was being offered by the very monster who had created the problem. The temptation was a physical, nauseating wave. It was not for herself, it was for her mother. This money was not a luxury. It was medicine. It was safety. It was peace. She could take it, sign the paper, and her mother would have the best care, the softest bed, a room with a window that faced the sun. All it would cost was this one small piece of metal. Her gaze flickered from the check to the curtained-off bed, where her mother's breathing was a faint, shallow whisper. She was so close to taking it. Her hand had almost begun to rise, and then her eyes fell to her own wrist. The watch, the cool, heavy gold, felt like an anchor in the storm of her fear. She saw her mother's face again, not the frail, sick woman in the bed, but the tired, strong woman who had raised her. The woman who had scrubbed floors and waited tables, who had come home with aching feet and a smile just for her. The woman who had given her this watch on her 18th birthday, her voice full of a quiet, fierce pride. "Integrity, my love," she had said, her fingers tracing the sapphire. "It is the only thing in this world they can never, ever take from you, unless you give it to them." The memory was a steel rod, snapping straight up her spine. The fog of fear and temptation burned away, replaced by a sudden, glacial surge of pure, cold fury. This man, this creature, had come into her home. He had threatened her mother. He had tried to buy her soul. He thought she was just like him, a thing that could be bought and sold, a thing that had a price. He had miscalculated. Her hand, the one that had been trembling, was now perfectly steady. She reached out and took the check from his grasp. Alexander's lips twitched in a faint, triumphant smirk. He had won. She looked him directly in the eye, her gaze as cold and hard as his own, and then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she tore the check in half. The sound was a sharp, satisfying rip in the dead quiet of the room. She tore it again, and again, and again, until the pieces were just meaningless scraps of paper. She let them flutter from her hand, a pale green snow of defiance, onto the cracked linoleum floor at his feet. "Get out of my home." Her voice was not a whisper. It was not a plea. It was a low, gutamural command, vibrating with a protective rage he had never encountered. Now, the billionaire sat alone in the crushing, opulent silence of his office. The meeting with his son had not been a comfort. It had been an agitation. Alexander's cold, immediate assumption of guilt, his ruthless, unfeeling efficiency in handling the problem, had left a bitter, metallic taste in the owner's mouth. He found himself pacing the vast, silent room, a prisoner of his own certainty. For 20 years, the story of his sister's betrayal had been the bedrock of his grief, the unassailable truth upon which he had rebuilt his life and his relationship with his remaining child. It was a simple, brutal narrative. His sister was a thief. His son was his loyal heir. But today, that simple narrative had developed a hairline fracture. A girl, who by all accounts was destitute, had refused $500,000. She had refused it out of principle, out of love for her mother. This was not the behavior of a common grifter who had stumbled upon a stolen artifact. This was the act of someone who believed they had a right to the watch. This agonizing cognitive dissonance, this chasm between his story and her actions, was why he had made a second call, a secret call, one he had not told his son about. A discreet tap, barely audible on the heavy oak door, announced his arrival. The man who entered was not like Alexander. He was not a presence. He was an absence. He was a man in a simple grey suit, with a face you would forget instantly. His name was Mr. Evans, and he was a man who dealt only in irrefutable, inconvenient facts. He held a single, slim manila folder. He did not sit. He began to speak in a low, sterile monotone. "The girl's name is Clara Reeves. She is 24 years old. She is, as she presented, a waitress. She is also, as of 3 hours ago, blacklisted from every restaurant in the city, an action initiated by your son's office." The billionaire flinched, a flicker of profound shame, the casual, systemic cruelty of it Evans continued, his voice unchanged. "She is the sole caregiver for her mother, Sarah Reeves. The name meant nothing to the owner. The medical bills are substantial. The eviction notice is, in fact, real." Evans paused, opening the folder. "And here is the information you primarily requested. Sarah Reeves, her mother. I ran her full employment history." The billionaire leaned forward, a new, cold dread creeping up his spine, a feeling far worse than his grief. He did not know what he was about to hear, but he knew it would change everything. For the last 15 years, she has been unable to work due to a degenerative neurological condition, but for the 10 years prior, she was a registered hospice nurse. Evans slid a single, laser-printed page across the vast, polished desk. The billionaire stared at it, his breath caught in his throat. "St. Jude's Hospice," he whispered the name. "A place of ghosts," a name he had tried for 2 decades to forget. Evans gave a single, small nod. "Your mother's facility." "Specifically," he said, his voice dropping slightly as he delivered the final, devastating fact. "She was on staff, on duty, and assigned to your mother's wing during the entire month of October, the month she passed away." The single sheet of paper lay on the vast, polished expanse of the desk like a bomb. The billionaire did not touch it. He simply stared at the typed words, his world, which had been fracturing all day, now beginning to dissolve completely. St. Jude's Hospice. The name was a key, unlocking a room in his memory he had sealed shut for 2 decades, a room filled with the scent of antiseptic and the sound of his mother's shallow breathing. The waitress's mother was a nurse. His sister had been there. The watch had vanished. His mind, trained for decades to find the simple, brutal line of cause and effect, was now presented with 2 warring realities. The first was his own, a narrative of a bitter, thieving daughter. The second was a new, horrifying possibility, that his sister, Amelia, had not stolen the watch, but had perhaps given it away. Given it to this nurse, Sarah. But why? Why would she give away an heirloom of such value? And if she had she vanished? Why the silence? Why the 20 years of agonizing, unanswered questions? The narrative did not make sense. Unless a new, far colder, and more reptilian thought slithered into his mind. He saw his son, Alexander, standing by the window, his back to him, all cold, reassuring efficiency. "I will take care of it, Father. I will have my security team run a full background check." He had seemed so certain, so quick to label the girl a grifter, a liar, so quick to dismiss the watch as a cheap knockoff. He had not been looking at it. He had not even been in the room for 10 seconds. How could he have known? The billionaire's blood, which had been boiling with grief, turned to ice. It was not efficiency. It was a diversion. It was not an assumption. It was a lie. His son had not been protecting him from a grifter. He had been protecting himself from the truth. The billionaire's grief, the hot, searing pain that had been his constant companion for 20 years, did not just fade. It was eclipsed. It was consumed by a new, vast, and bottomless emotion. A cold, dawning, and utterly terrible suspicion. He realized, with a clarity that felt like a physical blow, that he had been lied to, not just by his daughter, as he had always believed, but by his son, the loyal one, the heir, the one who had stood by his side, the one who had built the narrative of the thieving sister with him, the one who had benefited the most from her exile. The air rushed from his lungs. He was no longer a grieving father. He was a fool, a blind, manipulated old fool. He looked up at Mr. Evans, who was still standing, a quiet, grey ghost, in his opulent office. The billionaire's voice was a dry, raw whisper. "Leave me." Mr. Evans nodded, collected his single, devastating sheet of paper, and vanished as silently as he had arrived. The billionaire was alone. He knew, with an absolute, terrifying certainty, that he could not trust his son. He could not trust anything he had been told. There was only one person left who held the final piece of the truth. He had to see the girl, not to accuse, but to listen. The end had come. The apartment, which had been her fortress, her prison, and her sanctuary, was now just a collection of empty, hollow rooms. The sparse furniture they owned was already gone, sold for a pathetic handful of dollars to a second-hand dealer. The money already used to pay for her mother's temporary stay at a basic state-run nursing home, the one she had fought so desperately to avoid. Clara was on her knees on the cold, cracked linoleum, a single, battered cardboard box beside her. This was all that was left, her mother's personal effects. The landlord had given her until 5 o'clock. The sun was already setting, casting long, grey shadows across the floor, the air thick with dust motes and the smell of defeat. She was beyond tears. She was in a cold, numb place of profound failure. She had lost. Alexander, with his cold eyes and his limitless, cruel power, had won. She was blacklisted. She was homeless. And she had been forced to put her mother in the very place he had threatened. Her hands were raw, her body aching, but her heart was what hurt the most. It was a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She was sorting through the last drawer of her mother's small, cheap bedside table. It was filled with the detritus of a long illness. Expired bottles of pills, bundled cotton swabs, a faded photograph of a baby she did not recognize. Her fingers, numb and clumsy, brushed against something hard at the very back. She pulled it out. It was a small, plain wooden box, no bigger than her hand. It was dark, almost black with age, and bound by 2 simple, tarnished brass bands. A tiny, matching lock, green with verdigris, held it shut. She stared at it. This box. She had seen it her entire life, tucked away in the back of her mother's closet or under her bed. She had asked about it once, as a child, and her mother had just smiled, a sad, distant smile, and said it held her memories. It was the one, single thing her mother had ever kept private. A wave of guilt washed over her. It felt like a final, terrible violation, like reading a diary. But what did it matter? All their privacy was gone. They had nothing left. She ran her thumb over the lock, then remembered. She fumbled with the drawer, pulling it all the way out of the cheap dresser frame. And there, taped to the very back of the wooden slot, was a tiny, identical brass key. Her hands trembled, a new, strange feeling cutting through her numb despair, a flicker of something, not hope, but curiosity, a final mystery. She slid the key into the lock. It was stiff, protesting, but with a sharp, painful-sounding click, it turned. The lock sprang open. She lifted the lid. The inside was lined with faded, watery blue velvet. It was almost empty. There was a single, tiny lock of baby hair, tied with a brittle silk ribbon. A pressed, dried gardenia, brown and fragile. And at the bottom, tucked neatly, was a single, thick, yellowed envelope, folded in half. It was sealed with a plain wax-like substance. There was no name, no address. It was just a silent, waiting object. a secret her mother had guarded her entire sad life. Clara picked it up, her fingers tracing the brittle edges. It felt heavy, heavy with the weight of the unknown, and she knew, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that whatever was inside, it was the answer. It was the heart of everything. Her fingers, numb and clumsy from packing, fumbled with the brittle, yellowed envelope, the wax seal, now just a dark, meaningless smudge, cracked and crumbled under her nail, turning to dust. She unfolded the single, thick sheet of paper. The air in the empty room seemed to thin, the silence becoming a high, keening sound in her ears. The letter was written in a beautiful, elegant, looping script, the ink a faded, rusty brown, the words of a ghost. It began with two simple words: Dear Sarah, her mother's name. Clara's heart, which she thought was too numb to feel, gave a single, painful, hammering thud against her ribs. She sank back on her heels, the floor hard and cold beneath her knees, and read on. The letter was from a woman she had never heard of, a woman named Amelia. The letter spoke of a gratitude so profound it felt like a prayer. Thank you for being my mother's only friend. Thank you for sitting with her. Thank you for holding her hand when I could not. You were the only light in that cold, terrible house, the only one who saw her as a person and not just a name on a will. Clara's mind was a fog of confusion. Whose mother? What house? And then the letter's tone shifted, the elegant script becoming darker, the lines pressed harder into the paper, a testament of old, forgotten rage. My brother is a monster. Clara's blood ran cold. The words leaped off the page, a venom that had lost none of its potency over 2 decades. He only sees money. He only sees power. He has poisoned my father against me. He has told him I am a thief. He has told him I stole the watch. He has twisted everything. The watch. Clara stopped breathing. The watch. My mother wanted you to have it. She gave it to you, Sarah. It was not a payment. It was a gift. A thank you for your kindness, for being the only decent soul in our entire, broken world. My father would not understand. He is blinded by my brother. Please, keep it. Keep it safe. And remember her. Remember me. But never, ever let my brother know you have it. He will destroy you. He has already destroyed me. Clara read the last lines again and again. The room, which had been grey and cold, suddenly tilted. It was not just a letter. It was an affidavit. It was a 20-year-old testament. The watch on her wrist was not just an heirloom. It was evidence. The billionaire, his agonizing grief, his shocked, broken face. He was not a monster. He was a victim. He was wrong. He had been lied to, systematically, for half his life. And Alexander, his cold grey eyes, his venomous contempt, his immediate, ruthless, and total campaign to destroy her, to blacklist her, to threaten her mother, it was not just to retrieve a valuable object, it was to bury a secret. He was the brother. He was the monster. He had recognized the watch, and he was not trying to recover stolen property. He was trying to destroy the last living proof of his own diabolical, foundational lie. She, Clara Reeves, a fired, blacklisted, homeless waitress, was holding the one, single thing that could unravel an empire and expose the truth. The watch was not just her mother's memory. It was her mother's sacred, terrifying, and now world-shattering trust. A sharp, sudden knock on the apartment door shattered the heavy, ringing silence. It was not the authoritative, contemptuous rap of Alexander. This was different. It was hesitant, heavy, almost a sound of defeat, a knock from someone who did not want to be there, but had no other choice. Clara, her mind still reeling from the devastating truth in her hands, stumbled to her feet. The letter was a live wire, a burning, physical object against her palm. She was no longer a victim. She was a witness. She was the one, single key to a 20-year-old lie. She pulled the door open, her heart a cold, hard stone in her chest, ready for another fight, another threat. But it was not Alexander. It was his father, the billionaire. He stood in the drab, peeling hallway, not as a titan, not as a king, but as a broken, old man. His face, which she had last seen twisted in grief, was now a pale, grey mask of profound, searching exhaustion. His eyes, red-rimmed and hollow, were not filled with anger. They were filled with a desperate, pleading, and deeply apologetic vulnerability. He looked at the empty, desolate room behind her, at the single, battered cardboard box, and a flicker of deep, profound shame crossed his features. He had done this. His son had done this. He finally met her gaze, and it was she who held the power, my dear. His voice was a dry, raw whisper, a world away from the command he had wielded in his restaurant. I was wrong. His eyes were fixed on her face, searching for something, an answer, absolution. I know about your mother, he continued, his words slow, painful, as if he were walking on glass. Evans, my investigator, he told me. She was a nurse at St. Jude's. He took a single, shuddering breath, the name of the hospice a ghost in the room. I need to know what happened. I need to know about her. I need to know about my sister. Please. He was not ordering. He was begging. Clara stood there, stunned into silence. He did not know. He truly did not know. He was not the monster. He was the other victim. The letter in her hand felt impossibly heavy. The elegant, faded script held every answer he was searching for. It held the truth of his sister's love, the proof of his son's betrayal, and the key to his entire, broken life. She did not need to say a word. Her own anger, her own pain, dissolved, replaced by a deep, profound pity for this man who had been fed poison for half his life. Her hand, trembling, lifted the yellowed, brittle page. Sir, her voice was thick with an emotion she could not name. I think you need to read this. The billionaire's gaze was fixed on the yellowed, brittle page. His hand, the one that signed billion-dollar deals, the one that had gestured to fire this very girl, was trembling so violently he could barely take the letter from her. It felt impossibly heavy in his grasp, not a piece of paper but a slab of stone, a tombstone for a life he had never known, for a truth he had suffocated for 2 decades. He lifted it. His eyes, blurred by a sudden hot rush of tears, struggled to focus on the elegant, faded script. He read the first words, "Dear Sarah." He read the line about his mother, "Thank you for being my mother's only friend." A small, choked sound tore from his throat. He read on, his breath catching, his knees physically weakening, each word a hammer blow against the fortress of his grief. He read the part about the watch. "My mother wanted you to have it. She gave it to you." The floor seemed to drop away from him. It was a gift, not a theft. It was a blessing. His entire narrative, the bedrock of his sorrow, his anger, his very identity for half his adult life, dissolved into dust. And then he read the final, devastating and damning lines. "My brother is a monster. He only sees money. He has poisoned my father against me." The letter fluttered from his numb, lifeless fingers, landing on the cracked, dirty linoleum. He staggered back, his hand flying to his chest, a low, guttural, agonizing sound ripping from his very soul. It was the sound of a man breaking in two. 20 years. 20 years he had mourned a lie. 20 years he had hated his gentle, innocent daughter. 20 years he had loved, cherished, and empowered the viper who had orchestrated it all. The room was spinning, a grey, desolate blur. He looked at Clara, this stranger, this poor, homeless girl, and saw the face of the only person who had ever shown him the truth. And in that precise, sacred, devastating moment of absolute, blinding revelation, the apartment door was thrown open. It was not a knock, it was a violent assault. The door slammed against the wall, the cheap plaster cracking, the frame shuddering. Alexander stood on the threshold, a black, immaculate silhouette against the dim hallway light. He was a vision of pure, arrogant triumph. He did not see his father's shattered state. He did not see the ancient letter on the floor. He saw only the girl, the final, pathetic complication in his otherwise perfect, clean world. He sneered, his voice a cold, satisfied hiss, dripping with contempt. "Father," he said, his tone one of mild, weary annoyance, as if scolding a senile child. "I told you I would handle this. You should not be in this filth." He took a single, confident step into the empty room, his eyes scanning the single cardboard box with satisfaction. "It is done. She is a nobody. I have already had her evicted. The order went through an hour ago. She has nowhere left to run." He had solved the problem. He had protected the family. He finally turned to his father, expecting a nod, a word of thanks, a sign of approval. But he did not find a grateful parent. He found a stranger. The sound of Alexander's satisfied, cold voice hung in the dead, grey air of the empty apartment. He stood there, a monument to his own success, waiting for the praise, the nod, the affirmation of his power. Instead, he was met with a terrifying, profound, and absolute silence. The billionaire, his father, who had been a broken, slumped figure, slowly, terribly, straightened to his full height. He did not look at his son. His eyes were fixed on the faded, yellowed letter lying on the floor, a simple piece of paper that had just rewritten 20 years of his life. The grief, the confusion, the pleading vulnerability of moments before, all of it, in a single, silent, volcanic instant, was burned away. It was incinerated, replaced by a cold, pure, and incandescent rage that was more terrifying than any shouting. His face, which had been pale with sorrow, turned a dark, dangerous red. His hands, which had been trembling, clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides. He was no longer a victim. He was an executioner. He finally lifted his head, his gaze so full of a lethal, glacial fury that Alexander's smug, triumphant smile did not just fade. It was obliterated. It was wiped from his face, replaced by a sudden, ghastly, and dawning horror. Alexander's eyes darted from his father's terrifying new face to the floor. He saw the letter, the old paper, the faded, elegant script. He did not know what it was, but he knew, with the certainty of a man on a gallows, that it was the truth. He knew his world, the one he had built on a single, perfect, 20-year-old lie, was over. He took an involuntary step back, his arrogance shattering, revealing the small, panicked, cornered thing he had always been underneath. "Father," he stammered, his voice suddenly thin, pathetic. "I do not know what that is. She is a liar. She is poisoning you." The billionaire's voice, when it came, was not a roar. It was worse. It was dangerously, murderously quiet. "You lied." The words hung in the air, heavy as stone. "You lied." "For 20 years," Alexander began to babble, a torrent of desperate, useless words. "I did it for us, for the company." She was weak. She would have ruined us. She was a liability. The billionaire took one slow, deliberate step toward him. His voice, no longer quiet, now rose to a terrible, booming roar that shook the very walls of the pathetic, empty room. "You stole my sister from me." He was shouting now, the words tearing from his soul, a litany of his own stolen life. "You let me live in hate. You let me poison her memory. You let me mourn a lie, while you stood by my side, my loyal son. You." He pointed a shaking, accusatory finger. "You are the thief. You are the monster. You stole my daughter. You stole my life. Get out." Alexander flinched, as if physically struck. "Get out!" The billionaire bellowed again, his voice cracking, a final, devastating, and absolute command. "You are no longer my son." Alexander did not speak. He did not defend himself. He simply, utterly, collapsed. The mask of power and cold calculation evaporated, revealing the hollow, terrified creature beneath. He turned, his movements stiff and robotic, and fled. He stumbled out of the apartment, a man running from his own life, his expensive, hand-stitched shoes scuffing on the dirty linoleum, a pathetic, frantic sound. His footsteps echoed, desperate and fading, down the drab concrete stairwell, until there was only silence. The word, "Get out," still hung in the empty grey air, a final, irrevocable judgment. The billionaire stood in the center of the desolate room, his entire body shaking from the violent expulsion of his rage. The adrenaline, the fury, the 2 decades of stolen grief, all of it drained away at once, leaving him a hollowed-out, exhausted old man. He looked ancient, his face a roadmap of a lifetime of sorrow, all of it misdirected, all of it wasted. He turned, slowly, painfully, to face Clara. She stood by the single battered cardboard box, her hand still clutching the yellowed letter. She was the only other person in the world who knew the truth. She was the axis upon which his entire reality had just turned. His eyes, no longer burning with rage, were now a vast, bottomless ocean of unshed tears. He saw her, really saw her, for the first time. Not the grifter, not the complication. He saw the quiet, terrified girl who had refused $500,000 for her mother's memory. He saw the woman who had endured his son's threats, his cruelty, the blacklisting, the eviction, the woman who had, in the face of absolute ruin, protected the truth. He took a single hesitant step toward her, his hand, the one that had pointed in judgment, now open and trembling, a gesture of supplication. He started, his voice a broken, raw whisper. He could not form the words. He did not need to. He simply sank, his knees giving way, collapsing not onto a throne, but onto the cold, hard floor of this empty apartment. He looked up at her, this poor, homeless waitress, as if she were a queen. "Please," he whispered, the word a prayer, a desperate, final plea. "Can you ever forgive me?" Clara, her own face streaked with silent tears, did not hesitate. Her anger was gone, her fear was gone, all of it washed away by the tide of his profound, agonizing remorse. She saw not the billionaire who had fired her. She saw a father who had been robbed of his daughter. She knelt, her own knees hitting the floor, so they were at eye level. She said nothing. She just nodded, the tears falling from her chin onto the faded letter. He reached out, his hand shaking, and his fingers gently brushed the watch on her wrist. My mother's watch. His voice was thick with love, a love he had not allowed himself to feel for it. She gave it to your mother. It was a gift of kindness. His sister, Amelia. She was good. His voice broke. She was so good. And I let him poison me. He looked into Clara's eyes, his own spilling over. I can never repay you, he sobbed, the words tearing from his chest. Not for the watch. I can never repay you for the truth. You gave me back my daughter. You gave me back my sister. He was weeping, not with rage, but with a pure, unfiltered, 20-year-old grief, a grief for the love he had thrown away. 6 months later, the city's skyline had a new, softer addition. There was no glass and steel, no imposing tower. Instead, a beautiful, warm brick building, bathed in the soft afternoon sun, sat nestled among gardens. Carved in the simple, elegant limestone above the door were the words, "The Amelia and Sarah Foundation for Hospice Care." The atmosphere inside was not one of cold, clinical finality. It was one of profound, active, and dignified peace. The air was warm, filled not with the scent of antiseptic, but with the faint, comforting aroma of baked bread from the kitchen and fresh flowers on every table. Sunlight streamed through large, clean windows, illuminating rooms painted in soft, hopeful colors. In the main hall, Clara stood, not in a worn polyester uniform, but in a smart, simple, and elegant dark blue suit. She was not a waitress. She was the director. She was speaking to a new class of nursing graduates, her voice, once a timid whisper, now clear, steady, and filled with a quiet, unshakable purpose. She spoke of compassion, of dignity, of seeing the person and not just the patient. Standing just to the side, near a window overlooking the garden, was the billionaire. He was almost unrecognizable. The ruthless, cold mask was gone forever, the sharp lines of his face softened by a new, quiet peace. He was not the owner here. He was a visitor, a proud, silent partner. He watched Clara with a gentle, paternal smile, his eyes, no longer burning with grief or rage, now clear and full of a profound, restful light. He was a changed man, a man who had, in the twilight of his life, been given a second chance. He had poured his entire fortune, the vast, cold empire built on his son's lie, into this single, righteous purpose. This building, this foundation, was his atonement. It was a living monument to the 2 women his son had wronged, and he had failed. His gentle, lost sister, Amelia, and the kind, steadfast nurse, Sarah, who had honored her memory. His wealth was no longer a weapon. It was a tool of healing. Clara finished her speech to a round of warm applause, and as she turned, she caught his eye and smiled. On her wrist, the delicate gold watch with the single blue sapphire glinted in the sunlight. It was no longer a secret. It was not a burden. It was a badge of honor, a symbol that integrity was priceless, a constant ticking reminder that the kindest, quietest acts of love could, in the end, shatter the coldest empires and build a better world in their place. If this story about a lie that lasted 20 years and the integrity that finally broke it touched your heart, please give this video a thumbs up and tell us your thoughts in the comments below. Every like and comment helps us share more powerful dramas just like this. And of course, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a single moment of truth and redemption. And share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that while money can build an empire, it is integrity that builds a legacy, and that the quietest truth is, in the end, always louder than the loudest lie. Thank you for watching.